Hello and welcome to the fourth panel of the second Writers Guild of Great Britain Interactive Festivals. Tonight we are looking at creating narrative in procedural world, writing narrative with and for procedural generation, which means if you're watching the video of the event, you are having an entirely different experience from the people out here on the night. Tonight's panel has been organised by the Writers Guild of Great Britain, which is a TUC affiliated union that represents writers working in radio, television, film, theatre, animation, books, children's, and of course, video games. We're here to offer people contract vetting, advice, and assistance through your career. So one of the ways to think about a union, you can think of them as sort of like roadside assistance. So we're there if you hit one of those problems and you need somebody to come and rescue you in one of those career moments. But we're also there as sort of mechanics to make sure that you don't hit those problems in the first place. So it's always better to get your contract looked at before you get 6 months, a year further down the line and hit those problems. So we're there to hopefully to prevent problems. We're also there to talk to employers and to developers to make sure that contracts and things are in a good place and that the conditions are set in a positive way for everybody involved in the industry. Because one of the strange things is, amongst all of the joy of what we do, we're also in an industry. We also put on events like this one, and we put out the video games guidelines, a new version of which will be out shortly later on this year. My name is Andrew Walsh. I'm the co-chair of the Writers Guild of Great Britain Video Committee, along with Samantha Webb. I'm also a freelance writer, and I mention that because the Guild is made up of full-time staff and volunteers. So if you join us, you also get a chance to join the committee and then help shape these events and decide what the union does. Because we're not just there for members, we are actually driven by our members. We couldn't have made tonight happen without our sponsors, Artisy Software, who've also sponsored the other panels that we're having this week. There's still time to sign up for tomorrow's interactive event, Implementing Game Narrative, Taking the Words and Making them Magic. And just a reminder that after today's panel, Artisy will be running a separate event on their Twitch channel at 7:30, so we'll be finishing nice and prompt for today, so that you can hop over there and get an introduction to the Artisy software. They're hoping to put out some version of this on video at some point, but we can't give you details at the moment. We will put those out when we can. Please note that chat's off, but you still can send us polite and interesting questions and comments through the Q&A text at the bottom. And that's it. So without further ado, I'll hand over to the chair for tonight's event, which tonight is me, so that should make it nice and smooth, and I just sort of change the hats over. And I'll hand over to our panelists to give you a quick introduction to who they are, and to say hello before we start the event. I should have probably done that in a preamble, really. So who would, if you'd like to wave, if you want to answer any questions or as you go through, and then if you'd like to introduce yourselves, that would be fantastic.
Well, I've gone left to right, I guess. Hello, I'm Tom. I've been working as a freelance narrative designer for 15 years. I started out in the indie space on the Penumbra games. I worked on Faster Than Light, which is a wonderful procedurally generated story game. And I've also worked on games like Subnautica and the Talos Principle.
I don't know whether I'm supposed to go next, but I just will do so. I'm Emily Short. I'm a creative director at Fail Better Games at the moment. I have had a career that kind of spans between interactive narrative and doing freelance game writing and narrative design, and also AI. So that's kind of the touch point for procedural generation for me. And so my past projects include things like the Versu platform, which was designed around character-driven AI, where characters were deciding in social situations where they were going to, what they were going to do and where they were going to go. And so that kind of juxtaposition of things that are very procedurally driven with how do we get a good story out of this is one of my sort of major interests.
Hi, and I'm Tanya X Short. I'm the captain and designer and writer at Kit Fox Games. We're a small studio in Montreal, and I wrote The Shrouded Isle, Moon Hunters, Boyfriend Dungeon coming up soon. I'll probably be talking a lot about Boyfriend Dungeon because it's very much at the front of my mind. We're finishing it up right now. But I also, in what time I had, co-edited 2 textbooks on procedural generation, one that's more about all the types of procedural generation in game design, and one that's specifically about procedural storytelling. And I only wrote 1 chapter in there about personality writing. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Good ad. Yes. Buy that one. But I did get to talk to all these people, including people like Emily, about their thoughts on procedural storytelling. So I have a lot of opinions, even if I can't say that Boyfriend Dungeon has too much procedurality in it. I'm hoping to do that with future KitFox projects.
Fantastic, thank you. And we're off to a start already. We've got some controversy already going in. And that appearance of the book wasn't sponsored. That was purely driven by the fact that I own it and would recommend it completely. It's great. So to get us started out, because we have a real mix of everybody that's in today. So I'm actually going to start with the basics. So for people who are out there who are sort of wondering whether, is procedural generation something that becomes between boomers and millennials? Can you define, what is procedural generation? What does it mean? And then we can sort of build up from that basic onwards. So could you give us an outline of what you would say procedural generation is? What does it mean for games? And then we can build from there. I'm just going to start with the easy questions and run from there.
Well, I think one of the easier ways is maybe to give a very concrete example, in that if a game had 100 characters in it, for example, you could handwrite 100 names for each of them, or you could generate names for them. And in order to generate those 100 names, you would have to come up with the rules for what kinds of names are you generating? Is there such a thing as a last name? Is there gendered names? If so, which genders? Are there generational differences in names? All these sorts of things that you might bake in yourself as a writer when you handwrite 100 of them. You would instead have to collaborate with a machine or a programmer, potentially, to figure out how to translate that into 100 generated names. The beauty of that being that then you could theoretically generate 1,000,000 names after you have the generator working. Now, whether or not that's actually saving you any time or effort is a whole other question, depending on what game you're making and why you needed to name 100 NPCs in that situation. But you can extend that idea into also generating a whole story or a scene or a line of dialogue, etc.
So some of those applications that you were just getting into at the end there are the places that I've looked at most. So things like, how do we generate dialogue? Instead of just having a single line of dialogue that's always the same every time the player plays the game, how might we create or remix some character lines that represent what's going on in the story so far, how they feel about you, what mood they're in. And those kinds of generative techniques mean that you can have characters who seem much more responsive to what the player has done so far, and really kind of reflect the player's agency in the story. And then on the level of story beats, that can also be about, we've got all of these sort of small modules of things that can happen in the story that might be individual scenes, individual interactions. And then we've got a set of rules that says which of these can follow on which others. And so you get this very large space of potential stories, and then we're picking our way through it, depending on what the player has done and what they're choosing to do. So one of the other sort of interesting things about procedural generation is that often you actually are describing this very large space of possibility, and then you're searching in that space for what's going to be the best fit for the particular moment that you're in.
Yeah, I mean, you guys have highlighted something super interesting there. I often don't think about all the different applications of the procedural system. To me, I think about it in terms of stitching together bits of pre-authored story in certain ways, but of course, as you say, it goes through everything. You can have it at every level, from generating names to filling in details on dialogue lines to the entire story. And I guess my takeaway is procedural generation fundamentally is something, there's something vulnerable about it, where as a writer, you are handing off quite a lot of your authorial control in certain respects to a piece of code, which does that for you on the fly. And to me, that's a really interesting thing that is pretty unique to games.
So taking that question of the terror as you stand on the cliff about to jump into a procedural narrative. I mean, writing could be a scary process at any stage, and to any writers out there, please find the ways past that and enjoy. You know, go and play with the blank pages. It should be fun as well as terrifying. But we've got a lot of crutches in traditional storytelling. Everybody is sort of battered over the head about saving cats when they've been locked out of the room. We've had quite a few questions about that already. Or we've got the hero's journey, which are there supposedly to give us structures that we can look at to help us through. But does procedural generation sort of come along and knock those assistances from under us? Are we in completely new open waters? Or is there a crossover between traditional models and procedural generation? Can the two coexist, or should we just set fire to the old models and set free into the new ocean?
And I think there's a little of each. Like, there are some things that you could do with procedural generation that really move away from any kind of structured or authored narrative. And if you look at some of the very sort of simulation-rich games, at things like Dwarf Fortress, where you've got these really weird, interesting things that emerge from the system, but they're not necessarily any particular structure. Like, that's one model of where this kind of thing can take you. But at the other end of the spectrum, there are also ways that you can use procedural generation to basically shore up a structure that you have in mind. Like, you want the game to play in a particular way. You've got a particular sort of pacing to the story that you want to accomplish, or certain kinds of situations that you want to arrive at, except you've got this meddling player wandering around doing things and making a mess. And so part of what, in that context, procedural generation can do for you is find a way of saying, okay, I'm going to generate a backstory that fits this NPC right now that's going to get us back on track. Or I'm going to generate an intervention that is going to clue the player in about something that they have missed, in order to get them back on track. So there are both sides to that, and I actually find procedural generation can really help accomplish some of those structural aims.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I do find traditional writing structures inspirational when I'm trying to make a certain experience more satisfying. It'll often give a clue as to what might be missing. Like, because often you'll start out, you'll implement something, you'll put it in there, and then the player will start making a mess. And it is the traditional tools that help me identify, like, oh, we didn't foreshadow this enough. We have to put in more foreshadowing. Or, oh, we don't have enough time after the climax to really like live in that moment. Like, and so the procedural generation would never tell you that. Your machine co-author will never say, oh, you have to have a second act that does this and that. And so that is part of your value as a human, as the co-author, is being able to bring in that analysis when things are going a little bit awry.
Yeah, I think I think that's it. These classic narrative structures and rules that we all learn as writers implicitly or explicitly, they don't stop being true and necessary when you're procedurally generating stuff. It's just that the way you're applying them is different. Now you're trying to make sure that the code outputs something that has a story structure and a chronology and so forth, instead of being able to ensure it with your own hand. So the rules are still valid, but differently applied.
I never thought I'd heard Tom being the one that would be coming out as a defender of the hero's journey. That was a moment. That was. So your starting point, when people, because a lot of people are intimidated, I would say is the word, when they look at procedural generation, and a number of the conversations that were had in advance of this event were people sort of speaking with fear or trepidation about, what's this new world? So I'm going to ask a two-part question, because then we can forget one half of it and then try and remember it later on when we get into the things. So the first part is, are you saying that you start with a traditional model and then add procedural generation, or do you start with procedural generation and then move back to the traditional models? That's the first point. And the second point is, have you found, because I would say that we've got some pioneers here in procedural generation and narrative, have you found that your processes have evolved as your understanding, as the industry's understanding of procedural generation? You know, are we on an arc as people are developing these processes? Because the hero's journey is an analysis of things that have existed for a long time, but procedurally generated narratives are something which feel newer. So where do you start, and do you see that the processes and starting points are changing as procedural generation evolves?
Well, it's my turn, huh? For me, I mean, let's see. I only have, I think, two published titles that are fundamentally procedurally generated, which is FTL and zombie adaptation called Organ Trail, which is lovely. So I'm probably not the most experienced in the room on this, but I do love it and I do bring it into other projects. I think I start with the procedurality. Like, I mean, oh my God, trying to, like, I don't know how you even start with, like, designing an entire linear narrative and then trying to build in the procedurality, unless it's in very specific elements like naming generation and so forth. And even then, like, blimey, I mean, any program in the room knows the hassle of going back and recoding things to handle a new thing. But ideally, know what you're trying to do in the first place and code for it. So I would start there. In terms of evolution, I suppose something I noticed was just that more and more studios were coming to me in recent years with a kind of a knowledge of, experience of, an interest in procedural generation. In the old days, it was, you know, it was very traditional, at least in the area of the industry I work in, which is kind of medium budget stuff. And more and more, you know, people, they come and they say, we want to do it. We, you know, we've got the best programmers in the world. We're going to support you with them. We want to do something that's ambitious in these ways. We want to mix things up a bit. And so I think, I've hoped for the longest time. I'm so happy to see procedural generation becoming a bigger thing. And I see studios supporting that more. So I think the process is going to continue to evolve. But speaking for my personal process, I mean, I just don't get hired as much as I would like to work on procedural stuff to really have noticed any evolution in my process.
I mean, I think that what Tom said was absolutely correct, that you should know what you're making and why are you making this element procedural or not. And like, that was something we faced at the beginning of Boyfriend Dungeon. You know, I'd edited these books on procedural generation. I was really stoked about procedural generation. I think it's really fascinating as a designer. And I sat down and I looked at Boyfriend Dungeon and I thought, if we procedurally generate these sword boys, they're not going to be very cute. Like they're going to be really weird. And they're going to talk really weird. And like, we could have theoretically then, I mean, if we'd known we'd had 4 years, maybe we could have actually figured something out. We didn't think we were doing it for 4 years at the time. So we were like, let's just write it out. It'll be faster. They'll all be cute. It'll be great. And that was much lower risk for that type of romance fantasy. Now, if I wanted to make something that was much more of a comedy and much less sincerely emotive, I guess, I think that maybe procedural would have worked better in that case. But for me, the trend that I see is I do think that designers and narrative people, of which I think there's many kinds of narrative designers, who we probably need more terms actually for the types of work that narrative designers do. We need to differentiate those roles a bit more. But the major trend I see, or I hope I see, is this sort of separation between people who are looking to make a reactive world that doesn't have baked in story, and the story is entirely reactive, versus this is a world that is trying to have this arc. It is trying to bring you on this journey to this endpoint. Because that's the thing about journeys, is that you have to have that satisfaction at the end, I think, for it to feel like it was a journey to somewhere. And those are two very different things. Like the world outside there is procedurally generated, but it's not going to be satisfying necessarily in the same way that a little virtual world will be, especially if the virtual world knows what it's trying to tell me. that was a bit rambly, but that's what I'm excited to see in the future, is more and more simulations. Like, for example, Dwarf Fortress is a really good example of a little world that's not really trying to tell you a certain story, but it will follow a certain arc because of its physics, of the way that the little dwarves live and survive and suffer and eventually have not a great time. That will always tend to follow a certain structure, but it's not paced. In fact, I've talked about pacing a lot with Tarn, and he said, no, every time I've tried to add more hero's journey type stuff, it's added everything turns out much more samey. So I've always taken it out and I've written it off as something that doesn't fit with this game at all. And I think that's fair. So I don't know, I guess I'm saying like simulationist story versus storytelling-y story. Maybe those should be different words, but those are the main paths forward, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I would, this becomes repetitive at this point, but I would absolutely agree that, like, you need to know when you're adding procedural generation to a project, what it's there for. And I think a lot of that process actually is, it's not a million miles from other areas where you're trying to marry up your narrative and your gameplay systems. It's another place where there can be things that are being developed, being engineered, that need to be systemic, and you need to understand, like, how is this affecting the player's experience of playing through this, and what can we expect that this system is going to add to the player's experience of the story? What do we want to leave up to the system versus what do we want to make mandatory? So kind of seeing it that way, I think, makes it a little bit closer to the kinds of problems that people may already be used to dealing with in this space. I think in terms of process and where things are going, I feel like there's a lot of interest, a lot of enthusiasm. I often sort of start conversations with clients or people at other studios who sort of have seen some promise in procedural generation that really excites them, and they really want to go in that direction, but they don't necessarily know what all the pros and cons of that are likely to be or how to approach it. Sometimes people will come in and have kind of very over-engineered ideas of, like, we need to keep track of these 12 different things, and I'll say, no, actually, it would be much better if you, like, whittled this down a lot. But I think what is luring people in about that is the way that procedurally generated content can feel fresh and novel, the way that it can produce experiences that are really very compatible with kind of the game ecology right now, like things that are fun to stream and that are fun to watch and are not going to be the same every time you do them. And that also can just be really, really responsive to what the player is doing. And like, that's the piece that I personally feel most compelled by, is like this idea of heightening the narrative agency.
Yeah, I was just going to say that replayability element you mentioned is a big part of, I think, why especially bigger and bigger studios are probably excited, because the higher budget your game, the more you start worrying about what happens when people stream it. Is it spoiled? Is it actually going to be unique? Can we have unique reactive moments? And in subscription services, you also kind of want to compete to have 300 hours, no matter what. And I think it's Kate Compton who was quoted as, like, procedural generation is like traditional writing. You get 10 times the result for about 10 times the effort.
One of the things that I like about it, and this kind of gets back to your point about names and generations and that kind of thing, is that when you're writing something procedurally, you are expressing an entire system. And sometimes as an artist or as a creator, that is actually what you want to write. It's not, I don't want to write one character's experience with one situation. I want to write the range of things that could happen in this world or this situation. And that's actually a different thing to create, but it can be compelling as a piece of art, I think.
And that's almost more of a human experience, really. It's like, it's not just one human's, it's what is humanity's experience with this situation. That's interesting.
Yep, I can unmute myself. Ooh, I found the button again. Everyone was like, finally, it's quiet. No, I've managed to find the button. So the questions that are coming in, you've touched on quite a range of subjects there, and the questions which we've got coming in seem to be falling into a number of categories. So I think I'd like to start with some of the ones that had to do with plot, because I think you touched on it a couple of times in the answers, like you were saying, maybe you can use procedural generation to get out of things. But we've had a number of questions which relate to pacing. And so is it a case of you can use procedural generation? Should the player be finding their own pace? Should you be putting things in place to continue to try and find those things, which we normally do? You put all of your post-it notes out and you're looking for those moments of narrative tension in the build. Are there ways that we can feed the player back into those moments so that we can control the pacing of things? Or should we let the player explore and create their own pacing? Or does that depend very much upon the type of game you're making, and you can do either?
So I think it does depend very much on the kind of game you're making, but there are some strategies that I find myself coming back to again and again across projects. So one of those is thinking in those slightly higher level abstracted narrative terms as I'm designing about which of these beats are here to give some exposition, which of these things is here to let the player just spend a certain amount of time in a space, what am I doing with these pieces, and actually kind of representing some of those facts in the code or in the data that I'm using for procedural generation so that I can actually do things like define a scene and say, this scene is going to end after a certain amount of time because I really want the player to just experience this for a while. And this scene, on the other hand, is going to end after a particular piece of information has been delivered because that's what this scene is for. And so kind of bring those writerly considerations in, but in a way that the engine is actually able to express and honor, makes it much more kind of possible to deal with those issues. The interesting thing to me is that like the things that I've done in that space that have been most successful, players almost never recognize as being procedural at all, because they almost always feel like, oh, that just happened in a way that felt scripted and that must have been like what was intended and everybody probably had that same experience. And so, this slightly irritating thing of being a procedural writer is like people often don't recognize like what happened when they experience that. But one of the most successful sort of examples along those lines was when I did projects for the Versi platform. We had some scenes where the system would actually track, like, has the player ever encountered this particular NPC before? Have they ever encountered this particular piece of backstory exposition before? Because there were so many different ways the scenes could play out, like that couldn't be scripted. But instead the system would look at, all right, we haven't encountered this before, so when this comes up in dialogue through all of the many procedural ways that could happen, we're just going to drop in a little bit of interior monologue for the player introducing that thing. And it worked so well that nobody ever noticed that it was procedural at all.
Yeah, I mean, I'll follow up on this theme of some concrete examples because obviously, yeah, it depends so much on the game that you're making in terms of how you handle pacing in it. So, I mean, working on something like FTL, where basically the whole game is just jumping from one space location to another and having a battle and having a little story with some dialogue options in it. Pacing in that game, we don't need to handle pacing in the same way as another game, in the sense that the player is doing their own pacing and it's built into the gameplay to have a combat every so often, and you simply can't sit around. You will get a combat sooner or later. So the pacing in that game is simply about having a sensible balance of different kinds of events and having a random generator that is good to ensure that sometimes you jump to a new location, you get immediately attacked, and sometimes you jump to a new location and it's a trading post. And that's where pacing comes in, and it's a matter of the ratios of different kinds of events. Compare that to something like Subnautica, which is not a procedurally generated game, but it has some parallels in the sense that it's a fully open world which you can explore absolutely at your own pace. And therefore we have the same problems of worrying about the order in which player encounters story and pacing of the dramatic moments in the game, and is a more traditional linear narrative. And we have the problem of, well, what if player just explores for 10 hours and doesn't hit any of the story beats and then gets all of the story beats in the last hour? And with things like that, we handle pacing by throwing in hints. So if you simply haven't hit a story beat in 5 hours, we'll send you an extra radio hint reminding you that it's there and giving you a waypoint. but we still let you ignore it if you want to. And at the end of the day on that, we just bite the bullet and we say, if you don't want to, if you don't explore those locations and ignore them and you get an end-loaded experience of the story, then so be it. That's the way it is. And we just make sure that we write those events so that they don't totally contradict one another if they happen to occur one after the other.
So the intricacies of plot are one of remembering information, processing information, and feeling about where to go, which is something where the player can feel a little bit more control of it because they're choosing the order of events. But can the same be done with emotions? Where does emotion fit? Because again, looking at traditional storytelling techniques, if we go to the conversation I always have with screenwriters is they come back in floods of tears. The right version. There are many reasons screenwriters come back in floods of tears for other reasons, but for the right reasons, when they finally sort of gone and seen the cut, the edit's been there, every frame has been built up between each of those things. The editor has worked their magic. The composer has put every minimum crotch in place just to hit those moments. You can tell I'm not a musician. Hit those sort of emotional beats to build up to the bit where the tear rolls down the eye, and we all in the cinema feel that same moment of emotion at the same time. And it's a frame by frame process. How when we can't control those things in the same way in the timing of it, like things are always funny because of the timing. How do we proceed? How do we build those emotional beats when we don't have such a control over the time and pacing? Where does the emotion build and exist in a procedural world? We're doing all the easy questions, as I said.
I mean, I think for me, there are a lot of answers to that, but a certain amount of it is just like in the moment of choice is where the emotional gap is for the player. Like, and what I mean by that is when the player is in a plot situation where they're going to be making some kind of decision that's going to significantly affect them or affect NPCs, when they've got some dialogue option that feels very freighted, there are a lot of ways to make those moments feel really emotionally resonant. It's definitely a different technique from like I frame by frame have made this, sort of sweeping, beautifully lit, beautifully composed kind of experience. And instead what it's about is kind of setting up a situation where I've had time as a player to learn about the stakes. I've had time to care and understand that I'm making this decision that's going to have big consequences. And then I might have a lot of feelings about that. And I might want to be able to express those feelings in different ways. I might want to kind of carry those on into later in the experience. But I think that's where the kind of playground is for that sort of part of the experience.
Yeah, I would say that too. I mean, I feel like, the spectrum of control that the writer has, you have like passive media over here, and even the tightest scripted video game is over here, and then like a little bit past it is procedural. Like anytime the player has any active experience in the game, I think you've already given up so much of your control. The giving up just a little bit more for the procedural side of it is almost incomparable. Like, I don't know if anybody here has played the tiny obscure indie game Journey, but it's a good example of a game with a lot of emotions and almost no words at all. But because it is tightly written as an experience and paced in the way that you experience it, but it is still up to the player. Like there are certain moments that, depending on the player's experience, are very, very poignant or very, very forgettable, because it really depends on what's going on at that moment and how they're experiencing. Are they waiting on this precipice and looking out over it for a while? Or are they just the type of player that go like off the cliff as soon as they see it? The emotions are very different. And as a writer, you have to accept that no matter how much words you throw on the page, the player is still going to have control, or it won't feel good to them. And I think that is just part of being you have to enjoy that co-author. You have the machine as co-author, and you also have the player as co-author. So you have to be collaborative a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's so important, that idea of letting go and trusting player. And actually, all the mediums, including the totally linear ones, most of the magic is happening in the audience's mind. You know, your text or whatever is just a jumping off point, and if they're not filling in the gaps, it won't mean anything to them no matter what you write. And this is just an extreme version of that. And I think, you know, players are kind of very forgiving if 9 out of 10 of those random interactions, whatever format they're taking, are kind of mundane or ordinary or uninteresting or maybe even a bit broken. That 1 in 10 time when something unexpected and logical and wonderful and magic happens, that is worth all those other times. So player really brings that themselves. And what we can do, it releases us a bit from trying to write very flowery text and have really like detailed character relationships and worrying about, is my picture of these characters, like, is that going to communicate well and all of that? Because it's not in that, it's in the mechanics, it's in the code that's putting these bits together. Our job to create emotion is just to have that interesting system that plays off itself in an understandable but also sometimes unpredictable way, and gives player these interesting moments of choice. You know, depending on the kind of procedural thing that you're working on, very often I think a guideline I follow is actually I try and keep my text as minimal as I possibly can. I'm not trying to move player with my prose. I'm trying to take my authorship out of the equation so that player can project as much as they feel onto what they're experiencing. And really, that's the magic.
Thank you. So I think moving sort of emotion, sort of segueing to what you said there, Tom. Characters, again, we're used to those as being something which is in the provenance of the author's sort of creation in the mind, and something which you're building through. But I think even going back to the early XCOM, when you could name your characters, and it was like Bob died, even though it was just all the smallest action was naming the character. Where does character live with procedural generation? What are we looking at following the sets of lines that we're used to for creating character? Where should we be looking at finding those emotional resonances? Because it's there, and the feedback about Dwarf Fortress and Boyfriend Dungeon and again FTL, you get your little characters who are there in the crew, and then one of them dies, and no, where are the areas where we can build up character, and what are there any types of characters that do work or don't work when we're looking with procedural generation, strengths and weaknesses? Again, we're just going to do all the easy stuff. It's redefine writing in a name.
It's hard not to answer literally every question with, it depends on your game and your situation and your intended player experience. I'll say that the rule for me so far, the number one thing I ask myself when I'm starting to define any element, but especially a complex element like a character, is what differentiates it from the other characters? In what way is this character remarkable or worth existing separate from the other 100? Is it their experiences, depending on the game? Is it their traits, depending on the game? Is it their motivations, their behaviors, their abilities, their presence, their perceptions? It could really, again, it depends on your gameplay. But in Dwarf Fortress, for example, it is often what abilities do they have and what experiences have they had. So as they live, they'll continue to differentiate themselves, and that makes them more interesting to watch as well. They start out kind of boring, but then the more they sort of experience the fortress and the world, the more interesting they get, which also mirrors how we feel about characters and narrative and ourselves. So it feels resonant there.
Yeah. I mean, I think continuing on from that, a number of the pieces that I've done that have been more on the character simulation end of the spectrum, a lot of the time the question is, okay, what kinds of decisions can characters in general make in this story space, and how is that affecting like where the story is going to go? So that might be, you know, maybe this is a world in which the engine actually supports ideas like flirting and forming romances and making enemies with people, or maybe there's a different set of issues that arise in situations that people can be in. But then within those spaces, you know, what kinds of verbs are available to the player, what similar verbs maybe are available to the NPCs, and how might those be different between different NPCs? So, you know, we might have a game where there are kind of different characters that you can become friends with, and those friendships might affect the rest of the narrative and how you feel emotionally about those characters, whether later on you're willing to make important sacrifices for them, all of those kinds of things. But then when you get to the sort of nitty gritty of characterization, you have which of these kinds of ways of reacting does a particular character inclined to execute in the moment procedurally, and they're then kind of expressing who they are every time the player is interacting with them.
Yeah, God, there's I love procedural generation. So interesting. I need to do more. Yeah, I'm struck by how one character in themselves can be an entire procedurally generated game, right? It's so much like a character could simply be, you know, strength, speed, and agility, and that could be what makes them distinct, and that can make for an interesting experience. But then once you start adding memories and choices and playing those off against those abilities, how they're affected by one another, and then you've got a full circle system of one system affecting the other, and that's really the basis of a procedural experience, is having that dynamic system that is logical but unpredictable, and that's so cool. At the same time, I want to, like, since you guys have talked a bit about that, I'll talk about the other end of the spectrum, which is sort of a more pre-authored character. To me, it's also very interesting to have you know, your set of pre-authored characters with pre-authored names and attributes and backgrounds and so forth, set within a procedural world, so that in each playthrough you are seeing different sides of that character and how they respond in different situations, and sort of exploring the flexibility of the human character and how people change over time. So many different approaches to these things. I absolutely reject the idea that there's like a kind of character that is wrong for procedural generation. Like, obviously it's all the same characters as any other story. Arguably a wider range of characters. Yeah, I think there's going to be so much interesting stuff that's done in this area over the coming years. There's so much wonderful interactive fiction out there, which mostly stays in the realm of sort of quite ultra niche stuff, but is slowly really coming to the fore. And I love seeing more and more bigger budget stuff embracing those ideas and bringing it to a wider audience. And it's going to be so exciting what we can do. This, to me, is really the heart of what a video game story can be. We can do these linear narratives, but oh my God, that's not really embracing what our medium is as much as we could. So it's all very cool.
So looking at the fact that there has been a greater embracing of some of the processes that have come out of indie development, and there's been some developments come from AAA in different ways within different fields. Where are there any warning signs, or stepping around this and avoiding any libel suits, but are there any warning signs to come with things like the patenting of the Nemesis system, where we look at how these systems can be developed, and then we get someone doing something really interesting? The Nemesis system is a system in Shadow of Mordor, where the enemies evolve and are impacted by your gameplay. Do we see any worries about elements like that, where people might be taking away some of those things, or do we think it's a field where you can patent the system, but you can't patent the process? That's one of the questions that's come in today. There's a lot of really good, interesting questions coming in. Thank you for those. I'm amalgamating some of them because, so apologies if the wording is exactly the same as yours, because we've got quite a few coming in. But I thought we've talked a lot about the theories. I thought I would give an industry question with this one. So any thoughts or concerns about that?
Can anyone clarify what exactly was patented? Because my initial reaction is screw that. Like, there's already copyright law to cover your code, and if you're patenting at the level of the idea of having an enemy who responds to your actions and changes, I don't know how the hell you can legitimately patent that. This is not helpful behavior. But maybe they patented something much more specific than that, but I still think that's some bullshit. Sorry, I don't know if I can swear.
We'll bleep it out afterwards. Bleep.
Clearly. Yeah, I mean, I think in that particular case, it would be a lot more alarming if I didn't feel that there's, frankly, a huge amount of prior art that gets into a lot of the things that are interesting. And that's not to say that there's nothing that's unique about the Nemesis system, but I don't think it's likely to succeed in cutting out, vast swaths of possibility. The range of things I think about patent law probably do not fit into this this panel, and I generally feel quite frustrated about most contexts that would try to prevent me from sharing information as widely as possible, because I would rather live in the world where all of these available techniques and approaches are widely available and everybody gets to play with them as much as possible. And I think, despite sort of various people's corporate behavior, that's not likely to have been sort of significantly impacted in this case. That's my take on that. I do think, when it comes to sort of what is actually protected and corporately owned, like there's a huge amount of work that goes into tooling and pipelines and a lot of just internal knowledge within a company about how to even write for these kinds of things and how to accomplish, deal with all of the challenges that arise. And that is where the value is, in my opinion. That would be hard to carry somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I agree completely with you, Emily, and Tom. I feel like the number of people harmed by the patent will be very small, or limited by it. But the number of people limited by the fact, for example, like Watch Dogs Legion, they have a really interesting world of NPCs they're generating with lives and simulations and things. But nobody can play with that, and that's limiting more people probably. Like the fact that we can't, I don't know, or the fact that we can't mess with the Nemesis system ourselves. Like, it's unfortunate that we don't have a open source obligation or anything like that. But even just the fact that the knowledge of how to build things similar or learn from what they've done, you have to reverse engineer everything, which is much less efficient than if more corporations had incentives to be more generous with sharing their knowledge, sharing their learnings. Because I know Watch Dogs Legion had a few iterations there where they came close to having something and then rebooted it a couple times. And we'll never know what those were unless we buy a lot of drinks for a lot of programmers in secret, but I'm not doing that.
Buying developers drinks doesn't reveal any secrets at all. Before we get anybody in trouble, let's move on quickly. So one of the questions that's coming in again, just to deal with something which is more about process. In terms of tools that you use for either programming or for keeping track or for developing, everything from developing your ideas through to the actual presentation of procedural generation, are there any tools that people could or should look at? Are the ones that you are forced to use at gunpoint by the industry? So you would recommend getting to know them, sorry, the industry keeps using them. I mean, from my side of things, obviously, every writer tends to moan about Excel because a lot of writing ends up in there. When it comes to procedural generation, are the tools that are recommended for process or that are generally used?
I think this, again, like varies hugely, and it's not like there's sort of one standardized toolkit that, I mean, especially given like when we say procedural generation, that covers so much, even if we're restricting it to writing and not looking at procedural music or procedural level design or any of those things. There's still, a huge range of what could be meant by that, ranging from, we're writing content for storylets that are going to be remixed in some procedural way, or we're writing name generating grammars or all sorts of things. But there are a few spaces that I think are useful just to kind of get to grips with particular techniques. So I definitely would recommend, if people are interested in this space, taking a look at Tracery, which is Kate Compton's generative grammar system that is free to play with and quite, sort of has a lot of documentation and some interesting aspects to it. Because that is a good way of sort of getting familiar with what is going on in text generation. There are a lot of other things that I tend to use when I'm dealing with generation at a larger scale. So talking about like generative story or other aspects like that. And that often does come back to doing a lot in Excel or similar spreadsheet programs, like being able to identify how many pieces do I have that are of this type of content versus that type of content. What is my range of traits that I've got available for characters or whatever that is. There's a fair amount of kind of just math and looking at categories there. And then I also do a certain amount of writing scripts to run tests. And this is something where not everybody who identifies as a writer like really wants to do something that programmery, but it is a technique that is out there, is being able to play with your generative design and execute the generation a lot of times, look at lots of different traces. Like if this is building lots of different stories, like what are the stats on those stories, so that I can quickly iterate towards something that is going to work better.
When I started as a writer, I couldn't really write in anything other than Word. If I opened up anything other than a really big blank white page, I just felt like I got writer's block and I wasn't producing good work. And over the years, I've just had to get used to writing. I write in Google Sheets specifically. I don't know about Excel. I haven't tried to write in Excel in a long time. But I no longer freeze. Now I can look at Google Sheets and I can actually think creatively and write scripts, threads of stories. And it took some time to overcome that, but I do think it was worth the effort. It's much easier to deal with systemic lines of text in spreadsheets and traits and things like that. If you're talking, I highly recommend that you take the time to overcome it. If you, beloved audience member, also tend to freeze when you look at spreadsheets.
And I'll just complete it by shouting out the classics. 15 years ago when I started out, I was using Inform. It's still a powerful tool, although I haven't used it in a while. And my go-to, if I want to prototype some random idea quickly with a powerful, easy to use system, I still just use Twine. It's got everything you need. It's kind of, it's a straightforward interface. You can really easily and simply do a classic hyperlink style interactive dialogue, but it also has all of the programming features or all the features I need to do more or less anything I like. You can build an entire management game with a full data simulation in the background in Twine, and all the resources are there on the internet.
They recently added more storylet support as well. I haven't tried it since then, but it looked amazing.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just was excited.
No, I mean, I was done. You put the punctuation point on my point.
Stop sharing your enthusiasm, everybody. You're going to start, it'll be infectious and people will all want to do it. I mean, stop it. Look dour. Speaking of which, I remember when you were talking about the tests, the moment that John Ingold announced on Twitter that he'd found a way, and that Inc. is now running tests, and he'd done something within, or they're hoping to get that because he's been running tests on his projects, and the sheer joy of that moment that was coming through from there. So you can find joy in all of these elements as you go through.
Sorry, yeah, it was Inc., not Twine. That's right. That had the storylet support recently.
No, it is Twine.
It was Twine? Okay,
yeah,
okay.
No, I mean, Inc. You could build a storylet system around Inc. if you wanted to, but it was Twine that added recently.
All of these products are wonderful. We're so lucky to have such support these days. As I said, 15 years ago, we were literally just using a scripting language and running it through a compiler, and now we've got the full graphical flow chart and all these clever functions baked in. Nothing stops you from starting with a basic procedural story game these days. It's great.
And the joy of typing in Boolean statements the first time I actually came across those and trying to make your way around them. So thank you for that. One question that's come in, I think one thing that's been said several times, and don't apologise for it, please, because people are finding that some people have used procedural generation, some people are trying to define it, is the fact that I think whenever we approach a new medium or a new part of a medium or a new tool set, it's easy or safer or more contained to think of it as one thing. And I think you're lifting the lid very much on the fact that procedural generation is as with many things, is a toolkit there to be used rather than one field. So you can use it in many different ways. And as you said, Tanya, that it's there to be assessed for every project. And I think that's really, I think will help. As one big takeaway for people, just when you're approaching it, is just think of it as that rather than I'm going to learn all the procedural generation in one go. No, it's looking for where it's relevant and working through. And I think that's a really great thing to keep underlining. So thank you for that and demystifying it, because I think that's one of the things a lot of people have arrived with some trepidation. So demystifying it is fantastic. And so following on from that, sort of the opposite question, we've had a couple of questions along the lines of when would you not use procedural generation? Is there any point that you would just go, no, back away slowly, or as Tom seemed to want to do, would you add it to everything? Where do you go? I mean, is there other points not to use it? Are there points when you absolutely should?
I've definitely avoided it in cases where, I just don't have enough time. So for certain kinds of things, like coming up with a procedural system and testing it well, can be time consuming and effort consuming. And there are times when just writing something, unchanging is just the most quick and effective way to go. The other point is, if there's what is going to happen in the story is really pretty fixed in stone and there aren't a lot of different outcomes that it possibly could have, or it's a thing where the player is just not going to replay this very often, there's no gameplay value to that variability at that point. And that's a place where I also tend to back away from using that. And just, if there's going to be one experience that's the perfect experience, then just write that and don't generate anything.
Yeah, I think it can be tempting to try, and it would be so cool if each player had a different experience of this thing. But is the difference noticeable, meaningful? Like, would two players talking even know that they had it be procedural in the first place? And B, is it cool to you or cool to them? Like if they did notice, is the difference significant enough that it was worth all that extra effort to them? I mean, it can be really fun as a designer. Once you get into it, I think writing procedurally is extremely fun because it really feels like a different type of expressive medium, but you have to not use it when the outcomes will just be, well, the player experiences it once and walks away. What was the purpose really? It was just going to be worse than what you could do yourself.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like, I'm sure there's a middle ground, but it feels like there's a bit of two absolutes here where it's either a specific tool that you're using to solve a discrete problem, like we need to generate some names, or it's really, you go into this project trying to create a procedural narrative, and that's the core of the thing. Just kind of dotting it around here and there for the sake of it, or because it's cool, isn't the thing. And to make that concrete, I mean, I remember when I started on the Talos principle, the guys at Croteam were excited about what they were doing in Left 4 Dead at the time. They were excited about this, AI director who's responding to what you're doing, and they came to me and said, we want to do something like this for the game. Let's create a story that responds to what the player's doing in the game. And as much as I really wanted to do that game, I said to them, that works perfectly in Left 4 Dead, the incidental dialogues, the little one-liners that the characters say in response to sometimes quite complicated situations is wonderful. It works perfectly for that game. But the Talos Principle was a sort of lonely, isolationist, open world puzzle game where most of the players' interactions were solving puzzles, and just trying to use procedural generation for that just didn't really seem to add anything for me. So we ended up going with traditional branching dialogue instead. So there's totally cases where there's just no reason to be doing it. And I believe in making games that aren't procedurally generated. I'm just more excited doing ones that are.
And you could also make an argument for if it's giving you joy as a designer or writer to do it, and even if it's not meaningful to the player, you know, feel free. Like, it doesn't always need to be through the lens of commercially viable or whatever. Like,
as long
you know,
as your producer is not too mad at you.
yeah, exactly. As long as, you know, you're paying the bill for whatever's happening there, feel free to have fun with it and make something non-commercial. It's fine.
Yeah. I mean, the one other thing that I wanted to make sure that I got in here was that, you know, sometimes it's about like replayability and having a lot of change on replay. But the other big place that I find myself positively reaching for procedural generation is where I want the player to have a level of effect on the game story or the world or the setting that I just do not have time to hand create all the variations on. So like, I really want this to respond to all of these different things that the player has done. And the only way for me to achieve that level of granularity is procedurally.
Thank you. And I think this is a related question, so I should imagine there's a little bit of crossover between the answers. But is size everything when it comes to procedural generation? Because the thing that tends to come in is like, wow, procedural generation, that's infinite. So, I mean, there've been a number of different questions about how you should handle the length. You know, should you be looking at small contained experiences or huge open ones? Whether you should be writing masses for a character or whether one meeting should do it. But this doesn't have to be a big answer, or it could be a huge one. When it comes to procedural generation, is it something that is all just about the huge swathes of content, or are you looking at a smaller, more contained element? And I think that follows on from what you're saying, but there's a lot of people have been asking that question or questions about the amount of content required to make it work.
So I think a more useful way of talking and thinking about this than just size, which is a very, like, that's a kind of, it's hard to understand what that even means. Like, if you talk about size, you could say like, oh, there are, you know, 10 trillion variant dialogue lines that could be generated by this game. What does that actually mean? Like, if I'm substituting synonyms in for the same things and I'm also inserting some ums and ers, like, that difference is not actually significantly altering the player experience, even though that I could come up with a very large number to put on a website. So a more interesting sort of, to me, way of thinking about this is, what is the expressive range? Like, what variation is possible in what this system is able to communicate? And that might mean, like, yes, I've got lots and lots of different pairings that can be put together in lots of different interesting ways, and there's just a huge amount of data that I'm rejoining here. But there might also be other aspects to that. And it's also about, like, have I given you elements to combine and recombine that play off each other in interesting ways? So something I think about a lot is, you know, what are those individual pieces that are being included? Do they, when you juxtapose them, put them next to each other, do they generate kind of a new meaning in the gap between the two of them? In the same way that two tarot cards put together, like, suggests some kind of combined reading. And so that's less about how much data and more about, like, what data and what connections are you drawing between those pieces for the player.
Yes. I agree with that. I have not a lot to add.
It's a very agreeable panel, this one. Everyone's agreeing with each other. There's been no sword fighting or anything. So thank you. Talking about another process question, we've had a number of questions about the compatibility of voice with procedural generation. Should procedural generation really only work with text, or is there a place for voice? And then a similar question is how to deal with the nuance of localization with procedural generation. Is that something, as a way to just go, I'm sure it's difficult, push to the localization team, or is it something that you get very much involved with during the process to make sure that it's translating well and working across languages?
I think Emily is the expert on both of these topics. She spent many years on both of them, I believe. But I just wanted to really quick get in there that if you're going to have localization, get involved, because I don't think it's going to be possible otherwise. That's for sure.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. So on the voice front, the line of what is possible is moving very, very quickly. Like AI generated voices have come an immense distance in the recent past, and it's more and more possible to get line readings that sound like they were spoken by a human rather than by a Dalek. It's still not at a point where I would want to entrust any sort of key dramatic moments to an AI actor necessarily, and I think, you know, like skilled voice actors bring a huge amount to a game, so I don't want to at all imply that there's not a value in that. But the range of what is possible to do is steadily increasing, and I suspect that frontier is going to keep moving very quickly. Like there are a couple of different pieces to that. Like part of it is about like the quality of the voice models that exist out there, and just how much it sounds like a human voice. But then there's also the component of pacing, being able to map some new line of dialogue, some different words to a performance that has been captured from an actor, being able to dub some words in spots to kind of replace things in a variable way. So there are lots of things that are just becoming technically possible that were not 5 years ago, and I think that's going to keep happening. And I think what we're going to see is that kind of element coming in, you know, first where in the places in the game where there's kind of least emphasis on the dramatic importance of the moment and the most value in the variability. So I'm thinking of things like environmental NPC barks. Like that's a place where you can really kind of afford to do this kind of thing. And like if their delivery is not, you know, Oscar worthy, it's still kind of good enough and it's fun enough that they're responding to you, that makes it worthwhile. And then I think we kind of like gradually might see that move. So that's the sort of quick answer to that question. On the localization front, like, yes, this is a thing where you need to think about it when you're planning your procedural system. And you need to decide, like, how much do I really need the text itself to change, and at what level? Like, what is the unit size in the sentence that needs to change? And also, like, what languages am I localizing into? Because different languages have different kind of grammatical implications to doing that. So on the safe end of the spectrum is a kind of procedural generation where, you know, mostly you're not actually changing the contents of individual sentences, but you might be swapping sentences out. And that makes it more likely that you're going to be able to localize comfortably. Once you get to the level where you're building something out of, you know, word by word out of individual pieces, then it becomes much more challenging. And you either need to be working with somebody who is effectively a procedural writer in the target language, or you need to have been super, super disciplined about how you set it up.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on something you mentioned, that you mentioned like something being funny might also you might get away with a little bit more. And I do think that for now, while we're in this window, I mean, maybe in 10 years from now, you know, the AI voice acting will be in a very, very different place. But right now, I think if you were to think of like, where could I use this for comedy intentionally, it might actually work to your benefit, because procedural generation can be very, very funny. It's right in that realm of the gap of expectation and outcome that jokes are made out of. And like I made a comedy game called Bad Cupid as a prototype where two AIs grammatically flirt with each other, and we added voice acting on top of it, and it made it way better, even though the voice acting was extremely terrible. It was just like, but I mean, you never thought that it was people. You always knew it was two AIs. So it worked. And that's another way to think about it. Like, you don't always have to emulate humans. You can just sort of bask in the glory of machine dialogue and let players have a good time with that too.
So I'm aware we've only got Tanya for another sort of 10 minutes, but we will continue through the half hour. And thank you very much for squeezing us in, Tanya, for the section. So I'm going to ask.
Thank you. Sorry for the miscommunication.
Oh no worries. Thank you for fitting us in. So there's one question I'd like to squeeze in before you go. Oh, very quickly, someone's asked for the 2 books that you worked on. So please plug those.
So one is called Procedural Generation in Game Design, and the other is called Procedural Storytelling in Game Design, and they're both by CRC Press.
So we've got the plugin, which is good, and they are excellent books to look at on the topic. I'd like to come back to a question. Sort of, you use the word Windows, and often with technical and design advances, they come in steps. So there'll be then a space between before people then work out where to go next. So as an example, not completely related, but for instance, when it came to interactivity, there was a step where Half-Life and other games introduced, we can have characters in the scene, but they have to be behind a window. And the first time that they appeared, people were like, oh my goodness, there's a character in this scene. But very quickly, people were like, oh, there's a character behind a window again. Where are we with procedural generation? Where are the elements which will begin to wear thin, where people will begin to see the machines and the processes at work? So where's wearing thin, or where are the dangers when creating something where people will see the wizard behind the curtain? And what's got you excited about moving forward, where the possibilities are beginning to open for new scopes for storytelling? So are there pitfalls that are there, and are there opportunities that are?
Well, I actually think I'm excited that more and more players are familiar with what to look for, and to understand what to get excited about with procedural generation and what not to get excited about. I was initially slightly scared of the effect of No Man's Sky, for example, where they used procedural in their E3 announcement. It was very mainstream, the idea of procedural everything, millions of planets, and I was worried, oh, maybe this will leave a bad taste in players' mouths if they think procedural is going to be this amazing thing, and actually it's this different amazing thing that you experience differently. But actually, I think that was wildly educational. And now the average gamer can actually ask, well, what is being generated exactly, and why is that interesting? And that gives us so much more to play with, instead of people just being like, oh, it's procedural, exclamation point. Which is sort of where we were before. So I do feel like we're further along the track towards, like, as if we have gamers actually looking under the hood and sort of modding Dwarf Fortress more on Steam when it comes out, and really getting deep in there to understand what rules of procedurality are interesting about generating people and things like that. Like, we're actually going to be in a way better place, I think, for designers and players to make more interesting games together, because we can do more interesting things. Like, the problem that Emily was talking about is the worst, where you put in so much effort and you make something amazing and players have no idea it even happened. Like, that is the worst. That is a tragedy, right? Like, there was a beautiful piece of art and someone just sort of put it in the fridge, basically. Like, they didn't perceive it in the correct context. But I do think that we're getting towards a point where there will be more and more nuanced context. So I'm excited.
I think, speaking of the sort of educational side, I think a really useful thing for people to do is go play AI Dungeon. Because AI Dungeon is, for those who are not familiar with it, is using GPT-3. Well, one of it's 2, but there's a GPT-3 based version. Sorry, I wasn't sure. Never mind. Okay. But it's using text generation to respond to all of the players' inputs and come up with what should happen next. And so you might think, like, oh, this is the dream of the holodeck realized, right? Like, I can type in any command, any action, and see what happens. And it does kind of do that, but then it very quickly comes apart as well. And you almost immediately start to see like things going wrong, not making sense, not having sort of continuity. But I think encountering that is really instructive. It's very helpful to kind of understand like what are we, when we imagine the possibility of a narrative game where the player can do anything, which is something like people have been talking about that narrative dream since the mid-90s at least, and probably before then, versus like what it actually feels like. That helps people kind of refine what it is they actually are looking for, versus what they think they're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, what this is conjuring in my mind is something to do with this balance between the extremes of, on the one hand, the heavy data-driven simulation, which is almost raw gameplay, and on the other hand, how far you go towards the pre-authored thing, and finding the balance for your particular project between those things. Sometimes writing is the cheapest bit, and sometimes it's easy to fill an entire Excel spreadsheet with 10,000 different hobbies for the character in Watch Dogs. It's finding that balance, considering how long is player going to spend playing this game, how are they going to be interacting with it. You need some kind of pre-authored stuff to some degree somewhere to make it well, text-driven story at all, so that it's not purely a management simulation, although that's wonderful in itself. But then you also need to worry about how soon is it going to be repeating itself. As soon as I see that character who has the same damn character bio on their Facebook page as another character, the illusion is shattered. And that's a great challenge, is finding where to put your resources to keep that going. But to me, the exciting thing is kind of talking about the windows of the technology. Actually, all of the technology that we're using in terms of the kind of text and functions and mechanics has been there since Super Mario. Actually, what's now catching up is the expensive technological bits around how we're presenting it in terms of interaction between story and animation and voice and all of those sorts of details. That's where the big advances are happening. So yeah, it's interesting times.
Yeah, I'd be very excited if the one technology that is different and exciting, like Emily mentioned, the machine learning, if anybody managed to rodeo that into a playable, like, commercial experience, I'd be very excited about what genres would suddenly exist. But anyway, I have to go. Thank you very much for having me. This has been wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Tanya.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Yeah, poor old Douglas Adams making Starship Titanic and not realizing that the name was going to be ironic. Yeah, because it attempted to do all of those things, but before all of the design and technology had really been worked out to do it. I've got two quick questions because we've got 10 minutes left. So just one thing that's sort of bouncing on from that, looking at procedural generation and some of the comments that were made there. I love immersive theatre, but the problem is when I book an immersive theatre ticket, I don't know what I'm going to, because sometimes immersive theatre is as little as they've got one actor that walks through the middle of the aisle, looks at you and walks on, and to other pieces of immersive theatre that you're wrapped in the middle of it, you get to make decisions and all sorts. So is there an issue with terminology when we talk about procedural generation, where we've touched on it a couple of times, where it's just seen as this huge blanket term that makes it hard to navigate? Are there new terms that are coming out? Are there areas that need to be defined? We've got the ongoing question across the industry about what does narrative design mean, and how do we break that down into the actual terms it should have? Is there a similar thing with procedural generation? Has the discussion started, or are we at a point where it's beginning to happen? What are the terms people should learn or should start thinking about?
Well, that sounds like it's all you, Emily. It seems to me like procedural generation. I like the term for the concept as an overarching thing, but it seems like as we go forward, there's going to be a lot more detailed terms to describe all of these different ways in which we apply it.
Yeah, no, there definitely is. And I think I think there's basically two areas where the vocabulary needs to develop, right? So one is the player-facing vocabulary. And we've already been talking about kind of the literacy of players and what do they expect? What do they think they're buying when they get something? What are they actually attracted to? And like, do they understand, when they're getting a particular game, what that's likely to be giving them? So that's a space where, that's kind of gradually moving onward, but I think is like still very much kind of nascent, like players really understanding what's going on there. But you do see things like introduction of tags in Steam around things like choices matter and stuff like that. Like the existence of those tags represents clearly like the audience wants to check for certain characteristics in the games that they're going to play, and they might not know that the reasons in this particular game that their choices are being paid off is because there's a procedural system underlying it which permits that to be true. But it's still a way for us to talk to players and hear back from players about what they're looking for and why, and what promises and commitments are we making with this game when we're selling it to them. I think within the industry itself, and when we're talking, professionally with colleagues, we need a much better and more precise vocabulary. And that's because, both like in order to get projects off the ground and understand what we're doing, and especially just to do innovation at all, one of the things that I sort of think and talk about a lot is this idea of kind of conceptual inertia. Like if you want to do a really cool, inventive new project, but you have a large team of people that you need to bring on board with your like radical new vision, you tend to find that your vision gets simplified and dragged back towards what already exists, because that's the frame of reference that people have. So I think there are useful terminologies for us to distinguish around techniques and technology. And so things about like what is a search-based approach to procedural generation, for instance, like what is an expressive range of a generative system? Like there's a bunch of that kind of understanding for us to develop. And then there's also a set of terminology, which I think is a little bit further along maybe already, around like what are the design goals that we're trying to accomplish by bringing these systems into play. Like we want to build a storyline where the player has a lot of narrative agency. We want to allow for a lot of perceivable consequences to their actions. So some of those things do exist, and it just is a kind of a matter of extending that set of vocabulary.
Yeah, and I guess as we're developing those terms, slowly on a delay, that's going to melt through to the audience so that they can be more particular about what they're seeking. And at the same time, I've got to say, I've worked with so many different studios on even quite traditional established game structures, and we still find that we use the same words in totally different ways. Game seems to be so still so new, and still with so much different stuff going on, and no formal systems. It's still very, very common and practical, although not ideal, to sit down and just spell out exactly, what does X equal, and what exactly are we saying? Oh, so it's like there's quite a lot of that, and that does get us by, but more specific terminology would help.
Great, and we've got time for one last quick question. So there've been quite a few people asking for examples. So I know my mind always goes blank when I'm asked, what's the best game story ever? I always go blank. But can you? Are there any particular examples of things that you would recommend that people go and? You've mentioned a few through the talk, but are there games that people should go and play? Are there games that are industry starting points for conversations? So I regularly recommend games because I know everybody in the narrative community is discussing them. Therefore, if you want to be part of the conversation, it's best to have played at least a couple of these games, because those are the ones people are talking about, and we'll give you a frame of reference. Are there some frames of reference that we can give people to go and experience and experiment with? And not asking you for favoritism, there are other great products out there. These are just some suggestions.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of that we have already sort of mentioned briefly here, and I think, you know, the like whatever you do feel about the Nemesis system, like knowing about that is useful and worth sort of having in your toolkit to talk about. It's useful to know about Watch Dogs Legion. It's also useful to know about some of the range of things that are being done in kind of academic experimentation. So there's a lot of work out of UC Santa Cruz, and that goes back to things like Facade, which is a long time ago, but is still kind of a touch point for a lot of people. It's kind of useful to look at some of the things that those groups are doing. And then I think there are a lot of games out there that are doing something procedural that's interesting, where you might or might not realize that that's what it's doing. So for instance, the Inkle game Heaven's Vault, which is about sort of doing this outer space archaeology and discovering, you're actually piecing together a language as you play, which is super cool. But it also is doing a huge amount of story manipulation as you play, so that if you replay, you will get a distinctly different kind of experience out of doing that. And I think that's not necessarily immediately apparent to everybody, but it's worth kind of having a look at how that works, and also the kind of the juxtaposition of the fact that the narrative is spooling out in different ways, and then also how you as a player are interpreting that narrative is depending on what you've discovered in your archaeology. I could go on and on, but I will actually stop there in case Tom also has things he wants to add.
Oh God, I mean, you hit some of my usual touch points. I guess one that I rather enjoy, which basically doesn't have any procedural narrative, but does have a procedural narrative, is I got very hooked on Oxygen Not Included, which is a game which you know, doesn't really follow through on its promise of kind of distinct characters that you care about, and doesn't really have a lot of pre-authored story or procedural story in text form. But it's an entire management sim based on simulation of the environment, in terms of simulation of gases and materials and liquids and solids and these sorts of things. I find that very fascinating, seeing I use it as a kind of exemplar of, in an ideal world, what could we be doing with story, as demonstrated by what we can more easily do with basic game mechanics. So that's pretty cool. And I'm trying to remember the damn name of the game that first exposed me to procedural story, and I don't remember. I'm going to try and look it up in the last one.
Yeah, I was going to say, I put that in as a quick ending question, and there are so many examples that we've actually sort of hit time, and I think that summarizes neatly the situation when it comes to procedural generation. We've had 90 packed minutes, which have been fascinating. I've learned a lot through this time. The time has zoomed by, and I think we could quite easily go on for several days trying to explore just the basic starting topics with a lot of these things. But I do have to wrap things up because I know people need to go elsewhere. We will have, following this immediately, the Artisy event, which is going to be happening on their Twitch channel. So if you can stay around, please do go across to that, and you'll be able to learn some information about how Artisy works and the ins and outs that it might be able to help you with these things. You should now be seeing some contact details up on the screen should you wish to get in touch with some of the panelists and to stay in touch with what's going on. For the people that are doing the sweepstakes of the animals, I'm sorry that we didn't have any appearances today, so there's no one to add on to that section. I would just like to take this moment to thank very much the Writers Guild of Great Britain for hosting and organising the event. I'd like to thank Artisy for sponsoring the event. I would like to thank you very much for your time coming along today and for all of the questions. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to get through all of them. There was a huge wave of very detailed questions which were superb, so I hope we managed to encapsulate as many of them as possible. And last but not least, we can't hear you, but we will feel it through the tendrils of the universe out there. Please, can we have a round of applause and some cheers for our wonderful panelists tonight. I've learned a huge amount from being here, and I hope you have too. So please put your hands together, give us a wave, give us a scream, give us a fanfare, and good luck with all of your projects.